Hey guys, tonight we begin with a slow, gentle drift into the lives of medieval women. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe make a cup of tea, and let's quietly float back to a time where life was, well, not exactly easy. Medieval Europe, roughly spanning the 5th to the 15th century, is often romanticized in movies and books. Castles, knights, and fair ladies come to mind. But the reality for most women was much less glamorous. Think long hours of work, endless obligations, and tiny personal freedom. And no, glowing portraits of queens in silk gowns do not reflect most women's lives. Let's start at the beginning, with noble women. Of course, being a noble woman was slightly better than being a peasant, mostly because your life was cushioned with servants and wealth. But even then, it came with strings attached. Marriage was rarely a choice. It was a contract, often arranged to secure alliances, property, or influence. A young girl might be married off at 12 or 14, sometimes to a man twice her age, because dynastic strategy was apparently more important than comfort or consent. Imagine being 14, newly married and expected to manage a household, produce heirs, and maintain social appearances. Some noble women thrived in this role. They became politically savvy, learning to maneuver court intrigue like a game of chess. Others, well, let's just say not every story ends with silk gowns and gentle music. Let's float over to daily life, even in a castle. Noble women spent much of their day overseeing the household, which in medieval terms included hundreds of tasks: laundry, cooking, supervising servants, managing supplies, and ensuring everyone behaved properly. All this while wearing heavy dresses, layers of undergarments, and sometimes a corset-like garment to display the correct shape. Comfort was not really part of the equation. And then there was childbirth. It was constant, unavoidable, and incredibly dangerous. Childbirth could easily kill a woman in her 20s, and even if she survived, complications were common, leaving lifelong pain or disability. So while stories of noble women attending balls or riding horses are visually appealing, most of their daily life revolved around survival and duty. Now, let's not forget the peasant women. They had an entirely different, though equally grueling, experience. Work started at dawn and ended at dusk. Fields, animals, household chores, childcare, all on top of pregnancy and child rearing. Peasant women rarely had the luxury of rest or leisure, and illnesses, injuries, or a bad harvest could push their families to the brink. Medical knowledge was limited, hygiene was rudimentary, and superstition often guided treatment. A simple infection could be fatal. And because life expectancy was low, women often spent years pregnant or caring for children under harsh conditions. Marriage for peasant women was also strategic, but in a different way. Arranged or not, it often revolved around survival. A husband could provide food, shelter, and protection. But domestic abuse and exploitation were common, largely unchecked by law. Dowries were smaller or non-existent, meaning women had even fewer options for independence. Let's pause for a small ironic contrast. While noble women managed sprawling households, wielding influence quietly through letters and alliances, peasant women managed farms and families with little recognition. In both cases, personal freedom was limited. The difference was primarily in comfort, risk, and social leverage. Education for women? Rare but present. Some noble women received tutoring in reading, writing, or music. Many learned skills useful for court life, managing servants, embroidery, diplomacy. Peasant women often learned practical skills: weaving, spinning, brewing, cooking, Midwifery. Still, literacy was uncommon, particularly outside the upper classes. Religion shaped women's lives profoundly. Many women, especially noble or middle class, participated actively in spiritual life. Some became nuns, which offered a rare form of independence and learning. Others attended church regularly, following rituals and advice from clergy who often dictated moral and social behavior. But let's drift into darker realities. Legal status. Women had limited rights. Property rights were constrained. Married women's property often belonged to their husbands. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or defiance could have severe consequences, including death. So even simple acts of autonomy carried risk. Let's float over to the idea of beauty and social expectations. Women were judged for their appearance, chastity, and ability to manage households or bear children. Fashion, when it existed, was restrictive and heavy. Women could be criticized for being too plain, too ornate, or too outspoken. Even minor mistakes could damage a woman's reputation and family standing. In terms of health and nutrition, women's lives were a balancing act. Poor diet and hard labor took a toll on physical appearance and strength. Illnesses could be debilitating or fatal. Despite these hardships, medieval women developed resilience, forming networks of support within families, communities, and convents. Let's gently consider a few notable examples. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous medieval women, wielded influence in courts of France and England. She was politically astute, charming, and sometimes ruthless. But even Eleanor's life was constrained by marriages, politics, and expectations of motherhood. Even the most powerful women had ceilings they could rarely break. Hildegard of Bingen, a nun and mystic, offers another perspective. She became a scholar, composer, and writer, remarkable for the period. Yet her recognition depended on religious sanction, and she still lived within the strictures of her convent. So, as we settle into the quiet night, consider this: medieval women, whether noble or peasant, lived under relentless social, physical, and cultural pressures. Some found ways to navigate these pressures cleverly, others suffered quietly, their stories largely untold. Their lives were structured, constrained and demanding, yet they formed the backbone of society, maintaining households, farms, and families in times of hardship. Even when history remembers kings, wars, and knights, it's important to acknowledge the daily endurance of women who lived, worked, and survived in a world that offered them little choice. Part 2. Childbirth, marriage, and daily struggles. Welcome back. Drifting slowly through the lives of medieval women. By now, you've glimpsed the broader strokes. Limited freedom, endless work, social expectations, and the occasional moment of agency for the lucky few. Tonight, let's settle in a bit deeper and explore what it really meant to be married, bear children, and survive daily life during the Middle Ages. Childbirth was perhaps the most constant and dangerous element of a woman's life. For peasant women, it was a labor-intensive process done at home, often surrounded by female relatives or midwives. Pain, infection, and blood loss were common. Complications could easily be fatal, and medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. Even noble women, surrounded by wealth and attendance, faced significant risks. Hospitals as we know them didn't exist. Most care was home-based or administered by midwives. A single pregnancy could change a woman's life permanently. Chronic pain, loss of fertility, or permanent disability. Let's pause for a moment and float over to marriage customs. Marriages were rarely about love, especially among the elite. Dowries, alliances, and inheritance shaped unions. Girls as young as 12 could be married off to older men, expected to produce heirs and manage households immediately. For noble women, marriage was a political instrument, and their personal desires rarely factored into decisions. Peasant women's marriages, while simpler, were similarly practical, ensuring food, labour, and protection for the family. Daily work varied by class, but was relentless. Noble women oversaw estates, managed servants, organised feasts, and ensured resources lasted through winters. Peasant women, meanwhile, juggled farming, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, tending livestock, and producing textiles. All this work occurred on little more than a few hours of daylight and seasonal routines. Rest was rare. Exhaustion was a constant companion. Let's float gently into clothing and attire. For both classes, clothing had social and practical significance. Peasant women wore wool tunics, aprons and coifs, sturdy and functional, often patched and reused for years. Noble women wore layered gowns, often heavy, sometimes restricting movement. Clothing conveyed status, morality, and marital availability, and missteps could result in social criticism. Even something as simple as a coif tied incorrectly could invite gossip. Nutrition was another subtle but important part of women's lives. Peasant diets were repetitive: bread, porridge, seasonal vegetables, and occasional meat or fish. Malnutrition was common, especially during famine years. Noble women had greater access to meats, cheeses, and spices, though overindulgence could bring its own health issues. Regardless of class, women bore the burden of keeping children fed and households running, often sacrificing their own nutrition in the process. Religion played a quiet but pervasive role. Most women attended daily prayers, followed church holidays, and adhered to moral codes dictated largely by clergy. For noble women, this sometimes included patronage of religious institutions, while peasant women integrated faith into work routines. Some women, like nuns or mystics, gained a measure of autonomy, education, or influence through religious life, though within strict boundaries. Let's drift to social networks and informal power. Women often found support in family, neighbours and female networks. Midwives, herbalists and older women held knowledge essential for survival, from childbirth to household medicine. These networks allowed women to share advice, assistance, and sometimes subtle influence, even in a patriarchal world. Now, a quiet irony. While noble women had more leisure, they also had greater scrutiny. Court life involved etiquette, appearance, and diplomacy, and mistakes could harm family or personal standing. Peasant women had little leisure but far fewer observers. Their power lay in practicality, endurance, and local influence, unseen but essential. Finally, consider personal expression and culture. Music, embroidery, and storytelling were outlets for creativity and emotion. Even constrained by social expectations, women found ways to influence culture and maintain morale. These small acts, a well-woven tapestry, a clever song, a calming ritual, carried significance beyond their size. So, as we quietly settle into the night, remember, medieval women's lives were complex, demanding, and often invisible in the grand narratives of kings and wars. Yet they shaped the world in practical and subtle ways, keeping families, economies, and communities alive amidst uncertainty and hardship. The Middle Ages were harsh, but they were also filled with the quiet perseverance of women whose stories, when told, are as rich and textured as any knight's saga. Part 3. Legal status, property and influence. Welcome back. Still gently gliding through the lives of medieval women. If you've been following along, you know that daily life was exhausting, social obligations were relentless, and survival often demanded more than most people today could imagine. Now let's float into the legal and societal framework that governed women's lives, the rules they were born under and had to navigate. Constantly, in medieval Europe, a woman's legal rights were tightly constrained by class, marital status, and local custom. A single woman, especially from the peasantry, had very limited ability to own or control property. Her survival and livelihood were tied closely to her father or male relatives. Marriage generally transferred her obligations and her possessions to her husband. This meant that for most women, independence was rare and legally constrained. Noble women had slightly more leverage, often through dowries, inheritance, or family connections. A widow could inherit land, manage estates, and even wield political influence. Yet these privileges came with constant scrutiny and pressure. Women who mishandled property or tried to assert too much independence could find herself accused of mismanagement, gossip, or worse. Let's pause and float gently into the idea of marital law. Married women were expected to obey their husbands, as per common law and social expectation. In some regions, this obedience was codified. Wives could not enter contracts, sue, or own property independently. Exceptions existed, often tied to wealth, royal decree, or exceptional circumstance, but these were rare. Divorce was almost non-existent, and annulments required ecclesiastical approval. A noblewoman might petition the church for an annulment on technical grounds, like consanguinity, basically claiming she was too closely related to her husband, because medieval authorities loved paperwork and loopholes. For peasant women, escaping a bad marriage was largely impossible. A husband's cruelty, neglect, or abuse was often tolerated as part of the social contract. Despite legal limitations, women found subtle ways to influence society. Noble women often acted as regents for underage heirs, giving them temporary political authority. Queens and princesses could wield diplomatic power through correspondence, arranged marriages, and alliances. Even peasant women exercised influence within households and communities, deciding crop allocation, managing budgets, and mediating disputes. Religion provided another avenue for agency. Nuns could oversee convent finances, mentor younger women, and produce scholarship abbesses. In particular, held significant authority, both spiritual and administrative. Through religious life, some women achieved intellectual prominence unavailable in the secular world. Let's float briefly to cases of rebellion and resistance. Some women resisted imposed constraints. In subtle or overt ways, a few peasant women led or participated in revolts, especially when taxes, famine, or conscription threatened survival. Among the nobility, there were clever maneuvers, letters, legal petitions, and alliances that could shift power quietly but effectively. Even small acts, like refusing to marry a specific suitor or managing household affairs contrary to a husband's wishes, represented micro-resistances to the societal framework. Education, though limited, was another tool of influence. Literate women could write letters, manage records, or compose poetry and philosophical texts. Courts sometimes relied on women as scribes or advisors, particularly in diplomatic or estate matters. A few exceptional women, like Christine de Pizan in France, became professional writers and commentators on social issues, challenging assumptions about women's roles. Social norms were reinforced by culture, religion, and law, but human creativity and intelligence found its way through cracks in the system. Women who navigated these structures skillfully could achieve remarkable results. Still, the risks were ever present. Misjudgment could mean social ruin, physical danger, or forced submission. Let's gently consider a few illustrative examples. Matilda of Tuscany, a medieval noblewoman and military leader, managed territories, raised armies, and negotiated with popes. Her life shows that, with status and skill, women could exercise power, though this was extremely rare. Marjorie Kempe, a laywoman from England, became famous for her religious visions and pilgrimages. Her persistence in pursuing spiritual and personal goals, despite social ridicule, demonstrates individual agency even in restrictive contexts. Even for less famous women, day-to-day decisions, managing households, negotiating labor with servants or neighbors, protecting children, represented an invisible yet essential form of influence. So, as you drift slowly through these centuries, consider this. The medieval world was structured around male authority, legal restrictions, and social expectation. Yet within this structure, women carved out spaces of power, influence, and survival. They were constrained, but never entirely powerless. They were resilient, inventive, and quietly transformative. Even the mundane acts of daily life, cooking, spinning, praying, writing a letter, or instructing children, shaped society in ways that historians often overlook. The medieval world might seem harsh, static, and controlled, but women were constantly active participants in its slow rhythm, carrying the culture forward, one household, one decision, one act of endurance at a time. Part 4. Medicine, midwifery, and the quiet management of life. Welcome back, as we continue this gentle drift through the lives of medieval women. Tonight, let's float into the quieter, often invisible aspects of their world: medicine, midwifery, and the slow, constant management of life in a time without modern comforts. This is where women's labor, knowledge, and resilience become profoundly apparent. Medicine in the medieval period was, well, let's say it was a combination of observation, tradition, and superstition. There were no hospitals as we know them, no antibiotics, and few trained physicians available. To the average person, noble women might have access to physicians, usually male, but peasant women relied heavily on female knowledge, passed down through generations. This included herbal remedies, practical care, and a mix of folklore. Midwives were central to this system. They were skilled women, often older and experienced, who delivered babies and provided postnatal care. Their expertise could mean the difference between life and death. They knew herbs that eased labor, remedies for infections, and rituals to protect mother and child from harm. For many women, the midwife was the most important figure in their reproductive lives. Childbirth itself remained perilous. Complications were common, and mortality rates for both mother and infant were high. Yet women endured, relying on each other, rituals, prayers, and practical skills. This quiet endurance was perhaps one of the defining features of medieval womanhood: constant vigilance over life, even in the most dangerous circumstances. Let's float gently over the concept of household medicine. Women were expected to care for all members of their household: children, husbands, servants, and sometimes neighbors. They brewed remedies for fevers, cleaned wounds, prepared poultices, and managed minor injuries. Even a peasant woman who spent her day ploughing and cooking also became the family nurse, the midwife, and the counselor. Noble women, while less physically labor-intensive, held a similar role within larger households. They oversaw the storage of herbs, the preparation of remedies, and occasionally the supervision of physicians. In both noble and peasant households, Women's knowledge of medicine was practical, experiential, and essential for survival. Let's pause and float over the emotional labor involved. Women were expected to manage households, care for children, and handle illness, all while maintaining composure, social appearances, and often religious observance. The weight of responsibility was immense, and yet it was mostly invisible in official records. History often notes battles, kings, and decrees, but it rarely acknowledges the slow, persistent work of keeping families alive. Another subtle irony: while male physicians and scholars wrote treatises and received recognition, the majority of medical care for ordinary people was administered by women. Their knowledge was practical, refined over generations, and often life-saving, yet largely uncredited. Even when their remedies failed, women bore the social and emotional consequences. Education in medicine was mostly informal. Midwives trained apprentices. Daughters learned from mothers, and noble women sometimes received instruction from tutors. Written manuals existed, but were rare and often in Latin, inaccessible to the majority. Practical skill, observation, and tradition were the real teachers. Let's drift to women's role in nutrition and sustenance. Feeding a household required planning, preservation, and knowledge of seasonal resources. Women grew, gathered or purchased ingredients and transformed them into meals that sustained families through winter and famine. Cooking was labor-intensive and essential, a subtle yet critical form of management. Errors in food preparation could lead to sickness or death, especially in infants or the elderly. And what about emotional life? Despite relentless labor, social constraints, and danger, women found moments of connection, creativity, and expression. Stories, songs, prayers, and rituals created meaning and structure. Humor, gossip, and quiet rebellion offered psychological relief. Even small acts, like decorating a home for a festival or teaching a child a song, were forms of cultural continuity and resilience. Religion intertwined with medicine, labor, and daily life. Saints were invoked for safe childbirth, protection against disease, and guidance in moral dilemmas. Prayers, charms, and blessings were integrated into the routines of work and care. For women, this was not just spiritual, it was practical, a structured method to manage uncertainty and danger. Let's float over one more subtle truth. Medieval women were the backbone of daily life. They were caregivers, healers, laborers, managers, educators, and sometimes rulers. Their work was often invisible to chroniclers, overshadowed by wars, kings, and political events, yet without their labor, survival and continuity would have been impossible. So as we settle into the quiet night, imagine the rhythm of medieval life through their eyes. Early mornings in cold kitchens, tending fires and children, brewing remedies, praying for health, enduring physical labor, and finding moments of connection wherever possible. It was not glamorous, it was not easy, but it was life. Fragile, persistent, and remarkably human. Part 5. Labor beyond the household, guilds, marketplaces, and influence. Welcome back, gently floating through the everyday endurance of medieval women. If you've been keeping pace, you know that most of their lives were consumed by household labor, childcare, medicine, and survival. Tonight, we'll drift beyond the home and consider women's work in marketplaces, craft, and social networks. Places where they exercised influence quietly but effectively. In medieval towns, women were present in nearly every aspect of economic life. They ran stalls at markets, sold produce, brewed ale, or crafted textiles. This work was essential not just for their families, but for the urban economy at large. While legal restrictions often limited ownership or formal guild membership, women still found ways to participate, sometimes under the title or license of a male relative, sometimes independently if widowed or resourceful. Textile production, in particular, was a female-dominated domain. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were daily routines, sometimes combined with childcare and household management. For noble women, embroidery and needlework were partly decorative, partly functional, serving both household utility and social display. For common women, textile work was laborious, repetitive, and critical to survival. A well-made garment or properly mended clothing could mean the difference between comfort, warmth, or hardship during winter. Marketplaces offered subtle social power. Women who ran stalls or sold goods became nodes of information exchange. They knew who was sick, who owed money, who was expecting a child, and who had influence in the community. These networks allowed women to exercise social authority quietly, shaping the rhythms of community life even when denied formal political power. Let's float over to guilds. In some regions, women could participate in guilds, often as widows inheriting their husband's position. This allowed them to continue production, supervise apprentices, and maintain business connections. Formal recognition was limited, but the practical reality often meant that women ran workshops, controlled production, and made economic decisions that affected entire neighborhoods. Agricultural labor was another form of influence. Even noble women might oversee estates, directing crop rotations, labor schedules, and storage for winter. Peasant women often physically participated in planting, harvesting, and animal care. Their knowledge of crops, seasons, and resource management was crucial for survival. Mistakes could lead to famine, so even subtle decisions carried weight. Let's pause to consider leisure, which, as you might imagine, was minimal. However, when time allowed, women engaged in creative expression, music, storytelling, religious devotion, and craftsmanship. These activities were not merely decorative, they helped sustain cultural continuity and provided mental respite. A single song or embroidered tapestry could carry meaning, preserve tradition, and mark identity across generations. Marriage and family life remained central. Women navigated multiple roles: wife, mother, widow, and occasionally widow with economic independence. Their influence extended into arranging marriages, managing dowries, and mentoring daughters. Even subtle negotiations in these areas could affect social alliances and economic stability. Religion continued to guide daily life. Women were active participants in parish life, festivals, and charitable works. Some donated resources to religious institutions. Others became nuns or abbesses, exercising spiritual and administrative authority. Religious observance was intertwined with both labor and leisure. Prayer, festivals, and rituals provided structure, comfort, and social cohesion. Let's float to social risks. Women operating in marketplaces or guilds were still vulnerable to legal or social constraints. Fraud, theft, or failure to follow local regulations could bring fines, loss of license, or social censure. Even widowhood, which sometimes allowed independence, could be precarious. A woman alone without male protection faced economic and social challenges. Despite constraints, medieval women were remarkably adaptive. They balanced household and economic labor, childcare and education, spiritual practice and social influence. Their agency was often subtle, exercised through daily decisions, networks, and resilience, rather than formal power. Let's consider a few examples of notable women in economic or social roles. Hildegard of Bingen, though primarily known for her religious and intellectual work, also managed resources within her convent, supervised production, and advised on medicinal remedies. Christine de Pizan combined literacy and economic activity, writing professionally to support herself, while commenting on the role of women in society. Even ordinary women wielded quiet influence. A market stall could provide essential goods and information. A well-run household could sustain families through famine, and guidance given to children could shape the next generation. The threads of daily labor, care, and commerce wove together the fabric of medieval society, largely invisible but indispensable. Finally, consider the emotional landscape. Balancing labor, family, survival, and social expectation required constant emotional regulation. Women managed grief, joy, illness, and conflict with few outlets for expression beyond their immediate networks. Humor, small rebellions, and creativity were vital coping mechanisms. As the night deepens and you drift along this gentle river of history, remember this. Medieval women were the quiet architects of continuity. Their labor, physical, intellectual, and emotional, sustained households, communities and entire economies. Kings, wars, and politics may dominate history books, but these women carried the daily pulse of life, often unnoticed, always essential. Part 6. Education, literacy, and spiritual leadership. Welcome back, drifting slowly into the quieter, contemplative aspects of medieval women's lives. So far, we've explored labor, household management, medicine, markets, and subtle influence. Now let's float into education, literacy, and spiritual authority, with spaces where women occasionally carved out remarkable autonomy in an otherwise restrictive world. Education for women was limited and largely determined by class. Peasant women usually learned practical skills at home: spinning, sewing, cooking, childcare, and basic numeracy for managing resources. This education was crucial for survival but rarely recognized in historical records. Noble women had broader educational opportunities, though still constrained. They might learn reading, writing, languages, music, and some mathematics. This instruction often prepared them for managing estates, diplomacy, and courtly life. Yet it wasn't meant to foster independence. It was meant to make them competent managers and ornaments of society. Literacy was rare among women, but it existed. Some noble women wrote letters, maintained household records, or composed poetry. A few, like Christine de Pizan, became professional writers and intellectuals, producing works on history, ethics, and women's roles. Even with literacy, women faced social limitations. Their writings were scrutinized, their ideas often mediated through male authority or patronage. Let's float into religious life, which offered another avenue for influence. Nuns and abbesses held spiritual, educational, and sometimes political authority. Convents served as centers of learning, where women could study scripture, Latin, and even sciences or medicine. Abbesses managed property, supervised novices, and interacted with local rulers. Through these roles, women exercised autonomy impossible in secular life. Some religious women achieved remarkable recognition. Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess and polymath, wrote music, theological texts, and medical treatises. She corresponded with kings, popes, and scholars, advising on spiritual and temporal matters. Her influence demonstrates that religious life, while constrained, could offer a platform for exceptional agency. Education and literacy also extended into practical domains. Noble women used letters to arrange marriages, negotiate dowries, and maintain social networks. Peasant women passed down practical knowledge orally. Midwifery, herbal remedies, household management. Both forms of knowledge contributed to family survival and community stability. Let's gently consider politics. Even in an era dominated by male rulers, some women exercised political power, usually indirectly. Queens, regents, or widows could negotiate treaties, manage estates, or influence succession. Their power was often invisible, exercised through correspondence, advice, or family alliances rather than open rule. An ironic contrast. Medieval men often had formal authority, but relied heavily on women for execution, management, and practical oversight. Women, though restricted legally and socially, were essential in implementing political, economic, and religious decisions. Without their labor and insight, kingdoms would falter, yet their contributions were frequently unrecorded or minimized. Education also intersected with spiritual leadership. Women could teach younger girls, advise novices, or compose instructional texts. They transmitted cultural, religious, and practical knowledge across generations, creating continuity within communities. Even leisure, which was rare, could serve as a form of education or expression. Embroidery, music, storytelling, and religious reflection provided mental stimulation and a subtle form of personal development. Let's float over the emotional and psychological landscape. Women's roles demanded constant vigilance, adaptability, and intelligence, managing labor, family, household finances, spiritual duties, and social expectations required mental stamina. Networks of support, family, neighbors, religious communities provided relief, advice, and solidarity. So as you drift through the medieval night, consider this: women's education, literacy, and spiritual leadership were often subtle yet powerful. Even under restrictive conditions, they influenced culture, politics, family, and society. Their quiet agency ensured continuity, stability, and survival, the invisible scaffolding upon which medieval life rested. Part 7. Leisure, Arts, and Cultural Influence. Welcome back, drifting gently through the medieval night and the lives of women whose stories often go untold. We've covered labor, survival, medicine, literacy, and spiritual leadership. Now let's float into a quieter, more colorful realm: leisure, the arts, creativity, and the subtle ways women shaped culture. Leisure for medieval women was rare, but it existed in small, meaningful moments. For peasant women, a brief pause during a day of labor might be spent sharing songs, telling stories, or engaging in needlework. These moments were essential for emotional survival, social connection, and cultural continuity. Noble women had slightly more structured leisure. They could attend courtly events, participate in dances, tournaments as spectators, or enjoy music and poetry. Books, illuminated manuscripts, and private devotion offered intellectual stimulation. These activities, while framed within social expectation, allowed noble women subtle avenues for self-expression. Needlework and embroidery were not only practical, but highly symbolic. A tapestry could demonstrate skill, convey moral lessons, or record family lineage. Some noble women commissioned or personally produced intricate works that became treasured cultural artifacts. Even peasant women's simpler stitches carried cultural continuity, preserving techniques, patterns, and traditions across generations. Music and storytelling provided both education and entertainment. Songs passed down orally taught values, recounted historical events, or simply offered amusement. Women often acted as transmitters of these cultural forms, shaping collective memory and identity. They performed in households, villages, or religious gatherings, subtly influencing the auditory landscape of medieval life. Religious festivals provided moments of communal leisure and celebration. Women played roles in preparing feasts, decorating spaces, and leading rituals. These events allowed temporary relief from labor, opportunities for socializing, and occasions for performing influence within communities. Even simple rituals, singing hymns, lighting candles, reciting prayers, carried emotional and cultural significance. Let's pause to consider education intertwined with leisure. Music, storytelling, and visual arts weren't purely recreational. They were also vehicles for instruction. Girls learned moral lessons, practical skills, and social norms through these forms. Women, both noble and common, were central to maintaining and transmitting cultural knowledge. The ironic contrast: leisure was often framed as morally and socially appropriate activity, yet it provided autonomy. While a peasant woman's free hour was limited, it was hers to socialize, think, and create. A noble woman's embroidery or musical study reinforced status, but also offered intellectual engagement beyond domestic labor. Women also influenced culture through patronage. Wealthy, noble women sponsored artists, composers, and religious institutions. Their choices in aesthetics, architecture, and literature shaped the cultural output of entire regions. Even clothing, jewelry, and household decoration became subtle instruments of cultural influence, signaling taste, status, and values. In peasant communities, influence was quieter but pervasive. Decisions about which crops to plant, which remedies to use, which festivals to observe, and which stories to tell shaped community life. Even without formal recognition, women were central cultural organizers, curators of daily life, memory, and tradition. Let's float over the psychological and emotional impact of creative labor. Needlework, song, storytelling, and religious devotion provided mental respite, emotional expression, and social connection. Women navigated the demands of labor, family, and social expectation with these tools, creating small but meaningful spaces of autonomy. Finally, consider the continuity they enabled through arts, storytelling, and participation in cultural life. Women ensured that knowledge, values, and traditions persisted across generations. They were not merely passive participants, they were active shapers of cultural memory, even when history overlooked their contributions. So as the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the subtle tapestry of influence woven by medieval women: the stitcher at her loom, the storyteller by the hearth, the singer at a festival, the noblewoman commissioning a manuscript. Each act, no matter how quiet, was a thread in the vast fabric of medieval culture, invisible in grand histories but essential to the rhythm of daily life. Part 8. Marriage, motherhood, and social strategy. Welcome back, drifting further into the quiet currents of medieval life. Tonight, we'll explore the central institutions of marriage and motherhood, not in a dramatic, scandal-filled sense, but as steady, persistent forces that shaped women's daily existence and influence. These roles were demanding, often limiting, but also offered subtle channels of agency. Marriage in the medieval period was rarely about romance. For peasants, it ensured economic stability, survival, and social cohesion. For noble women, it was a political instrument. Dowries, alliances, and succession dictated unions, and personal desire was often secondary. Girls could be married off in early adolescence to much older men, expected to bear children and manage households immediately. The practicalities of married life were relentless. Household management, child rearing, social obligations, and oversight of servants or labourers fell largely to women. Even noble women, surrounded by attendants, managed complex estates, oversaw accounts, and ensured resources were allocated efficiently. Peasant women juggled physical labour in fields or workshops with childcare, cooking, and social obligations, all without the luxury of delegation. Motherhood was equally demanding. Pregnancy carried high risk due to limited medical knowledge. Childbirth could be fatal, and infant mortality was common. Women had to balance labour, domestic duties, and childcare, often under conditions of scarcity or hardship. Despite the challenges, mothers were central to education, moral instruction, and cultural transmission. They guided children in language, religious practice, social norms, and practical skills, shaping the next generation. Let's float over the idea of social strategy. Even within constraining structures, women navigated society with intelligence and subtlety. A noble woman might leverage her children's marriages to secure alliances, strengthen influence, or protect family estates. Peasant women managed social networks through neighbourly cooperation, community knowledge, and informal negotiation. Dowries were a key element of social strategy. They represented both economic and symbolic investment, influencing a woman's marital prospects and her family's standing. Mothers often had significant input into these arrangements, advising daughters and negotiating with potential in-laws. Even small dowries could alter social mobility, and strategic marriages could secure protection, resources, or influence. Women also exercised influence through household diplomacy, managing servants, negotiating with tenants, or resolving disputes required subtle skill. A well-managed household could enhance family reputation, maintain economic stability, and even extend political influence. These skills, though largely invisible in historical records, were crucial to the functioning of medieval society. Let's drift over emotional labour, which was constant and unrecognized. Women mediated conflicts, offered counsel, soothed distress, and maintained the social fabric. Even in times of crisis, famine, disease, or social unrest, women's efforts often preserved family and community cohesion. Motherhood offered both constraint and opportunity. While responsible for the survival and upbringing of children, women could shape character, loyalty, and alliances. Children became instruments of social strategy through arranged marriages, inheritance, and education. And mothers were the architects of these future networks. Religion intersected with marriage and motherhood. Women observed religious customs surrounding birth, death, and family life, which reinforced both spiritual and social norms. Prayers, rituals, and participation in festivals structured daily existence and provided a framework for coping with hardship. Even peasant women found subtle ways to assert influence. A well-tended plot of land, a successful harvest, or a clever negotiation with neighbours could enhance status and secure survival. Through persistence, knowledge, and community ties, women exercised agency in practical and meaningful ways. Let's pause for a gentle reflection. Marriage and motherhood, though demanding and restrictive, offered avenues for influence and legacy. Women who navigated these roles skillfully could protect families, manage estates, and shape future generations. Their strategies were often quiet, invisible to official records, but central to social and economic stability. Finally, consider the cumulative effect. The labour, education, household management, creative expression, and social negotiation of medieval women created a persistent, stabilizing force. They carried culture, knowledge, and survival across generations, even as history often overlooked their contributions. So, as you drift through these medieval centuries, remember that the story of women is not always dramatic or violent. It is a story of endurance, subtlety, creativity, and quiet, persistent influence. Marriage and motherhood, though demanding, were also channels through which women shaped the world in ways both visible and invisible. Part 9. Exceptional Women, Challenging Norms and Leaving Legacies. Welcome back, drifting gently into the realm of exceptional medieval women. By now, you've seen the daily endurance, labor, and subtle influence of most women, but a few stood out, navigating societal constraints in remarkable ways, leaving legacies that echo through history. Let's float over their stories quietly, without the urgency of drama, just as a slow meditation on endurance and ingenuity. First, consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most politically influential women of her time. She was queen of both France and England, not simultaneously, but still impressive. Eleanor managed estates, negotiated alliances, and even accompanied her husband on the Second Crusade. She was a patron of the arts, supporting poets and musicians. Despite the political turbulence around her, imprisonment, rebellions, and family conflicts, she maintained influence and shaped the cultural and political landscape of Western Europe. Her story demonstrates that even in a male-dominated world, skill, intelligence, and strategic alliances could yield remarkable agency. Next, let's float to Christine de Pizan, a professional writer in a world that rarely acknowledged female intellect. She wrote treatises on ethics, history, and the roles of women, advocating for education and recognition of women's capabilities. Her work was unusual because it combined intellectual rigor with practical concern for women's place in society. Through her writings, she created a subtle but enduring cultural impact, influencing both contemporaries and future generations. Religious figures also challenged societal norms. Hildegard of Bingen, an abbess in Germany, composed music, theological treatises, and medical texts. She advised emperors, popes, and rulers, blending spiritual authority with practical expertise. Her life demonstrates that religious life, while constrained, could serve as a platform for intellectual and political influence. There were also noblewomen acting locally in extraordinary ways, women managing estates, negotiating with local authorities, and supervising economic production exercised significant influence. Even without formal titles, their decisions affected land use, harvests, labor allocation, and social networks. In peasant communities, women who organized collective labor, managed resources, or mediated disputes were quietly central to survival and social cohesion. Let's float to the idea of cultural preservation. Exceptional women often shaped literary, artistic, and musical traditions. Their patronage, scholarship, and creativity preserved knowledge and refined cultural forms. Even daily domestic activities, such as embroidery or household music making, contributed to the broader cultural milieu. Consider subtle forms of political strategy. Women could exercise power through marriage negotiations, guardianship of heirs, or control of dowries and inheritance. A carefully managed household could serve as a microcosm of political authority, extending influence into local communities. Even peasant women, through kinship networks and practical management, impacted social structures in meaningful ways. Education, literacy, and religious involvement amplified their influence. writing letters, maintaining records, managing estates, or advising religious communities were all avenues of agency. While male-dominated society often minimized or ignored these contributions, the reality was that women's work and intellect shaped both local and broader historical outcomes. Even ordinary women could leave subtle legacies. Daughters learned skills from mothers, knowledge passed down quietly over generations, community traditions, folk medicine, and local practices often bore the imprint of female expertise. Through persistence, labor, and education, women created continuity, the invisible threads that connected past, present, and future. Finally, let's reflect on the cumulative effect of exceptional and ordinary women alike. From daily labor to intellectual endeavor, from religious devotion to economic management, women sustained medieval society. Their lives were complex, constrained, and often underappreciated, yet they were central to the rhythm of the era. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine a medieval world held together not just by kings, battles, or political decrees, but by countless women, visible and invisible, ordinary and extraordinary, shaping the fabric of life through endurance, intelligence, creativity, and subtle influence. Their stories remind us that history is rarely just about power and conquest. It is also about quiet persistence, daily resilience, and the human capacity to shape the world from within limitations. Part 10. Enduring Legacies. Reflection and Conclusion. Welcome back. Drifting gently to the final stretch of our exploration of medieval women's lives. By now, you've traveled through labor, medicine, marketplaces, education, arts, marriage, motherhood, and exceptional figures who quietly shaped history. Tonight, we'll reflect on their enduring legacies, the subtle, persistent influence that shaped society, culture, and daily life across centuries. Medieval women lived in a world that was physically demanding, socially restrictive, and politically male-dominated. Yet within these constraints, they carved out spaces of influence, creativity, and survival. Their labor, largely invisible in official histories, formed the backbone of daily existence, tending households, managing estates, producing textiles, raising children, and caring for the sick. Even in small acts, women shaped culture. Through storytelling, song, embroidery, domestic music making, and religious observance, they transmitted knowledge, values, and traditions. Generations of girls learned practical skills and moral lessons from mothers and grandmothers. Through these quiet transmissions, cultural memory persisted and communities maintained cohesion. Let's float gently over the more visible contributions. Noble women, abbesses, and exceptional figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Christine de Pizan, and Hildegard of Bingen expanded the possibilities for female agency. They managed estates, advised rulers, composed literature, created music, and shaped religious and intellectual discourse. Though rare, these women demonstrated that even in restrictive societies, intelligence, skill, and strategy could yield lasting impact. Marriage and motherhood, often framed as constraining, also offered channels for subtle influence. Dowries, alliances, and household management allowed women to shape family strategy, protect resources, and ensure the survival and prosperity of future generations. Even peasant women exercised agency through kinship networks, cooperative labor, and community leadership. These efforts were rarely recognized in chronicles, yet they were essential to social and economic stability. Education and literacy, when available, empowered women to act in religious, intellectual, and practical domains. Abbesses managed property and communities, tutors instructed young girls, and literate women corresponded across regions. Knowledge allowed them to navigate constraints with skill, ensuring both survival and legacy. Leisure, creativity, and cultural participation, though modest, played crucial roles. Embroidery, music, storytelling, and festival participation offered emotional respite, social cohesion, and cultural transmission. Even small acts of creativity contributed to the broader cultural fabric of medieval life, reinforcing identity, tradition, and memory. Let's pause to reflect on resilience. The lives we've explored were not dramatic in the sense of battles or conspiracies. They were quiet, persistent, and demanding. Yet these women endured hardship, adapted to changing circumstances, and influenced the world around them in ways both subtle and profound. Their stories remind us that history is built not only on conquest or official acts, but also on daily labor, endurance, and invisible networks of care and creativity. As you drift through sleep tonight, imagine the faint hum of a medieval household, a woman stirring a pot over the fire, a child learning a song, a needle pulling thread through cloth, prayers whispered before dawn. Consider abbesses writing letters, noblewomen negotiating alliances, and peasant women managing harvests. All these acts, small or grand, visible or invisible, contributed to the continuity of life, culture, and society. The enduring legacy of medieval women is their quiet persistence. They survived, they adapted, they educated, they healed, and they shaped the world without fanfare. Even when history overlooked their names, their influence persisted through generations. Carried in skills, stories, and traditions, they were architects of daily life, stewards of culture, and silent pillars of resilience. So tonight, as your eyelids grow heavier and the modern world fades from view, remember these lives, not filled with battles or dramatic coups, but with labor, love, intellect, and quiet determination. Medieval women remind us that history is often subtle, cumulative, and deeply human. It is in endurance, creativity, and persistence that the world truly moves forward, quietly but inexorably. And with that, we gently close this chapter of history. May your sleep be calm, your dreams reflective, and your appreciation for the quiet endurance of human lives quietly enriched.